There we go. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to be back at this wonderful conference and to talk about topics that we feel so strongly about. I don't have a presentation. I only have this slide. People asked me yesterday also to share links or QR codes where they can contribute. So there's the QR code for the on-chain and also for Lightning. If anyone would like to contribute to Lex Libertas, to the work that we are doing. Now, it is now the end of January, but it already feels like the year should be nearing its end. So far, 2026 has been a year of turmoil, both in South Africa and abroad. I need not remind you of Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, Davos, or Donald Trump's Board of Peace, nor the Iranian ships in the harbor over there, a continued string of corruption scandals now revealed at the Madlanga Commission, nor the fact that the most unpopular minister in cabinet appears to be the leader of the opposition. One world leader after the other is expressing concern about the vulnerability of the world order as we know it, or as the French President Emmanuel Macron put it, where international law is trampled underfoot and where the only law that seems to matter is that of the strongest. There is a growing concern that we might be entering a brave new world, which, if you read Aldous Huxley, you would know is not a good thing. There is, however, a recurring theme, a golden thread that carries through all of this. It is that there is a growing consensus that the current consensus is not sustainable. And this is what I would like to talk about. The world is changing, but should we? If I say that the current consensus is not sustainable, what does that mean? The consensus has been described in different ways. It has been called the Westphalian consensus, the post-World War II consensus, and the post-Cold War consensus. When we speak of the Westphalian consensus, we refer to the Peace of Westphalia that was agreed upon in 1648. The key idea here was that the world is primarily made up of sovereign states, each ruling within its own territory, and each recognized as legitimate within its borders. Now that might sound obvious today, but it wasn't obvious at the time. Most importantly, the result was that authority became defined by the state and resulted in the rise of an international order built around treaties, diplomacy, and formal rules between governments. The post-World War II consensus is built on the notion that states should be judged not by whether they exist, but how they are governed. And it brought with it several key assumptions. A belief that the danger is not disorder, but the wrong kind of order. That order had to be defined in a very particular way, and that conception of order had to be defended with violence if needs be. A deep suspicion of group identity, especially ethnic, national, or religious identity, because these were seen as the fuel that made mass mobilization and atrocity possible. An emphasis on universal individual rights as the safest antidote to tribalism, communitarianism, and tyranny. A growing reliance on international rules and institutions, not only to coordinate states, but to act as guardians of a moral framework that supposedly stands above particular nations and peoples. This is where we began to see the rapid growth of international bureaucracies and expert institutions that claim not merely technical authority, but moral authority. And over time, the argument quietly shifts. So the never again instinct, which was understandable and even noble, gradually became the justification of permanent centralization, permanent surveillance, permanent intervention, and permanent suspicion of anything that is too local, too organic, too rooted, or too particular. The post-Cold War consensus developed after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. It was predominantly interpreted not merely as a geopolitical victory, but as an ideological one, that liberal democracy had not only defeated communism, but history itself. This is why Francis Fukuyama's phrase, the end of history, became so popular. The argument was not that events would stop happening, but that the world had discovered the final model, the ultimate political arrangement, the final form of human development, and that everything else was now an outdated or an inferior form. And from that point onward, a very narrow set of political and moral assumptions became the standard by which all societies were judged. For example, democracy came to mean one particular institutional package rather than a broader principle with multiple possible expressions. Human rights came to mean not only protection against cruelty, but increasingly a comprehensive moral program deeply embedded in an ideological sense of virtue. Equality came not to mean equality before the law, but equal outcomes enforced by state policy. The legitimacy of a country was increasingly measured by its conformity to this model, not by whether its people were flourishing, stable, and lived free in a practical sense. In other words, the political form and process mattered more than the outcome. This is perhaps the most important reason why the Western world in particular turned a blind eye on the genocide in Rwanda, because celebrating constitutional reforms that made the country appear more liberal and more democratic in paper was more important than condemning ethnic extermination within the country itself. This is also why it's so difficult to criticize the South African government. Now, despite their differences, these three frameworks ultimately form a collective whole, producing a cohesive set of prescriptions. At its core, it's about decision-making, about creating a monopoly on conclusions. The consensus concludes on your behalf how you should think, how you should behave, how you should speak, and ultimately who you should be. We are told that great thinkers have already settled these questions, that these conclusions are correct because they were produced by the system, delivered by the system, and presented by the system. And because the system is good, we are told the outcomes must be good. To reject the outcome, therefore, is to reject the system. And so disagreement is moralized. If you reject the outcome, you must, by definition, be something detestable. But there is a reason why this so-called consensus is fraying. There is a reason why it was doomed from the start. It's because it is built on a philosophical foundation that inevitably leads to, and in fact requires, disengagement from reality. At the heart of this consensus is the explicit insistence that we should replace what is natural with what is artificial. And that is the dark side of Enlightenment philosophy. The Enlightenment deserves much of the credit it receives, but not enough has been said about its shadowy side, especially the belief that progress requires the systematic abandonment of inherited, organic, and natural forms of communal arrangement. Now, let me explain what I mean. One of the great ideas of the Enlightenment became known as Cartesian proceduralism, the idea put forth by René Descartes that we have to doubt everything we see, hear, and personally experience, and that we have to follow certain methods, certain processes of thinking and doing in order to reach desired outcomes. And that if the process is correct, the outcome must be good by definition. So to bring it back home, if the election is free and fair, the president will be good. And if the Constitution is written properly, the government will be accountable. Several Enlightenment philosophers, including Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, pleaded for natural order to be replaced with artificial order in order to achieve what they called progress. Progress, however, is not defined. it became a vague utopian idea of freedom, detached from how humanity had understood freedom for thousands of years. And so this new understanding of progress demands the abandonment of the old ways and the adoption of new ones, where what is old is defined as bad by default, and what is new is defined as good by default. The logical consequence is that we are no longer defined by the communities to which we naturally belong, by the wax in which we were carved, to use Aristotle's analogy. It dictates that the cultures that we cherish, the traditions we naturally hold dear, have to make way for the Leviathan, the almighty centralized state, that we are not political animals, communal creatures, or cultural beings anymore, but simply a collection of individuals, a so-called aggregate of men, stripped from everything that gives us value, from the forms in which we find fulfillment, and coercively bound together by the centralized state. We have been told that even though these assumptions wage war against our most basic instincts, that it is good for us because the intentions are good and the theory is extensive and conclusive. After all, we are reminded that we are but mere simpletons, that some theorist, some philosopher who has access to expertise that we can never acquire has spent endless nights behind his desk reading articles, writing papers, and drawing up plans on our behalf. And so the appropriate response has to be grateful compliance. And even though these plans might at times seem dodgy or dubious, we are reminded that the intentions are good, and we are told to remember the obvious truth that our road to heaven is paved with their good intentions. And ultimately, what it boils down to is that we should embrace their theory at the expense of our own experience, that we should not believe our lying eyes, as Descartes cautioned. Now, am I suggesting that we turn back the clock? Absolutely not. That would neither be possible nor desirable. We live in a world of artificial intelligence, digital infrastructure, global networks, and unprecedented technological power. We cannot and should not pretend that these things do not exist. The mistake is not that we have built artificial systems. The mistake is that we are allowing artificial systems to redefine what it means to be human. The real task is not to reject the artificial, but to re-anchor it in the natural. And this is where decentralization becomes more than a technical concept. It becomes a necessity. One of the great myths of our age is that complex societies can and should be effectively managed from the center. The more complex the world becomes, the more power is concentrated, supposedly to keep everything under control. But in reality, this concentration produces fragility, not stability. When decision-making is centralized, errors scale, mistakes become systemic, and failure becomes catastrophic. This is why we always say that implementing a policy that has already led to failure more aggressively would do nothing other than to create a more aggressive failure. This is why decentralized solutions keep reappearing, even when they are resisted, ridiculed, or suppressed. People instinctively understand that local knowledge beats distant authority. Skin in the game beats abstract expertise. Voluntary cooperation beats coercive uniformity. And experience beats theory. Decentralization is not an ideology. It is a pattern that emerges whenever people live realistically within the limits of human nature. But this is a Bitcoin conference. Yet, fortunately, you don't need me to explain Bitcoin, but philosophically, Bitcoin matters because it represents something far bigger than simply a digital asset. It represents a refusal to accept that trust must always be centralized, a refusal to believe that legitimacy only flows from institutions at the top, and a refusal to outsource responsibility entirely. Whether one adopts Bitcoin or not, the impulse behind it is unmistakable and unignorable. People are looking for systems that are transparent, more accountable, closer to home, and more grounded in reality. And this brings me to what I believe is the most important idea of all: de facto reality. Throughout history, real change, macro change, was rarely the result of winning arguments within existing frameworks. It came from building parallel structures that work and then letting reality do the persuading. Not asking the system to allow an alternative, but simply to build an alternative and then achieve recognition once it's unignorable. People do not abandon failing systems because they are convinced by theory. They abandon them because they discover something better. This is true of governance, and it is true of money. When communities organize themselves effectively, they do not ask for permission. They demonstrate competence. They build credibility, and over time, legitimacy follows reality, not the other way around. At Lex Libertas, this is the framework from which we operate. We do not believe that freedom can be engineered from the center. We do not believe that legitimacy can be imposed by decree, and we do not believe that one model of governance must apply uniformly to deeply different communities. Our focus is on self-governance, subsidiarity, and pluralism. That means reclaiming decision-making at the lowest feasible level, allowing communities to organize themselves, and accepting that diversity in governance is not a threat to democracy, but a safeguard against tyranny. In a fragmented world, stability will not come from forcing everyone into the same mold. It will come from allowing many forms of order to coexist. So the real question is not whether the world is changing, because it clearly is. The real question is whether we will continue changing blindly, clinging to abstractions that no longer match reality, or whether we will scale and change consciously, guided by human scale, human nature, and conclusions founded in experience and hard-earned wisdom. Will we double down on artificial systems that flatten everything they touch, or will we recover the ancient virtue of courage, a virtue that we are now told is a vice, because courage threatens the system. Courage to take a stance in what we say and what we do, but most importantly, courage to go out and build real-world solutions. We need to understand that even though the idea of self-governance has been vilified and is today depicted as a yearning of the past, self-governance has always been the default position, the foundation on which political life was built, the cornerstone of freedom. If you cannot govern yourself, you as a community and you as a citizen of your community cannot be free. Yet today we are bizarrely told that governing yourself, making your own decisions, organizing your life within the context of your community is somehow an abandonment of freedom. And when we allow the system to distort our conception of what it means to be free, we will surely fall. Edmund Burke said that when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. In an age obsessed with control, decentralization is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of common sense. It is the recognition that complex systems flourish when power is dispersed, responsibility is shared, and trust is earned rather than imposed. The world is changing, it always has, but should we? And the answer to this is both yes and no. Yes, we should embrace new technologies and opportunities, but no, we cannot abandon human nature. We cannot abdicate our responsibility, and we dare not reject the basic principles of freedom. The question is thus whether we will embrace change in a way that restores what is human, whether we will use this moment to build systems that serve real people in real communities, living real lives, because the future cannot be built on better abstractions, but by a return to reality. It will be built by those who are willing to take responsibility where they stand. Thank you very much.